Get that blind girl out of this room immediately. Can't you see this man is taking his last breaths? This is absolutely no place for a child." That was the very last thing I heard the lead surgeon scream right before my heart monitor flatlined. I remember the coldness of the hospital sheets against my skin and the rhythmic, terrifying beep of that monitor right next to my bed. My name is Arthur. For most of my life, I firmly believed that money could buy absolutely anything: power, comfort, time, and even life itself. I had spent decades building an empire, accumulating millions in my bank accounts and assuming that I was the untouchable master of my own destiny. But in that sterile hospital room, stripped of my expensive suits and my pride, I was nothing more than a dying, terrified man. The doctors had already delivered the final verdict. There was nothing more humanly possible they could do for me. The disease had spread aggressively, ravaging my body from the inside out in a matter of months. The world-renowned specialists I had flown in from across the country simply lowered their heads, adjusted their glasses, and quietly told my legal team to start preparing my final affairs. They gave me less than 48 hours to live. It is absolutely terrifying to realize how useless a massive fortune becomes when you are suffocating in your own failing body, desperately gasping for a breath of air that simply won't come. Money couldn't buy me an extra second on this earth. As I lay there, helpless and staring at the bright white ceiling, memories began to uncontrollably flood my mind. I hadn't always been the ruthless, distant businessman everyone thought I was. As a child, I used to kneel and pray with my mother every single night. I remembered her worn-out Bible and the soft, comforting sound of her voice singing hymns of hope and deliverance. But as my wealth grew over the years, my faith shrank and eventually died. I had traded my intimate conversations with God for board meetings, profit margins, and stock market reports. Now, at the very end of my journey, facing the terrifying abyss of eternity, I found myself desperately trying to remember how to pray. I wept bitterly. I begged for mercy. I cried out for just one more chance, but all I received was what felt like the absolute crushing silence of heaven. It seemed my weak, hypocritical prayers were just bouncing off the hospital walls, unable to reach the ears of the Creator I had ignored for so long. I was profoundly alone. The people who crowded the hallway outside my room only cared about who would inherit my companies. My heart was completely shattered, not just by the excruciating physical pain of the disease, but by an overwhelming spiritual emptiness. I was rapidly slipping away, losing my grip on reality, convinced that my life would end in complete darkness, regret, and despair. My breathing grew incredibly shallow. The machines attached to my chest suddenly started sounding a loud, frantic alarm, a chaotic symphony announcing that my organs were finally shutting down. The nurses rushed in, shouting medical terms I couldn't understand, and my vision began to blur. The edges of the room turned black. I closed my eyes, fully ready to surrender to the cold, inevitable end. If you have ever felt like your prayers were hitting a solid brick wall, or if you have ever believed that heaven had completely gone silent on you during your absolute darkest hour, please don't stop listening to this. If you are feeling the gentle presence of God through my testimony right now, please don't forget to casually subscribe to the channel because you need to witness how He powerfully moves when the world says it's impossible. As the doctors stood around my bed, watching the monitor and getting ready to declare my exact time of death, I had no idea that my life wasn't actually over. If you think the silence of God means He has permanently forgotten you, just wait until you hear exactly what happened after that little girl ignored the doctor's screams and slowly walked toward my hospital bed. The monitors around my bed were screaming in chaos. The world-renowned doctors, who just hours before had confidently walked the halls of the most expensive private wing in the hospital, were now staring at me with a sickening mix of pity and frustration. My legal team had already gathered right outside the glass doors, clutching leather briefcases, filled with inheritance documents and trust fund transfers. To the world outside that room, I wasn't Arthur the human being anymore. I was Arthur the estate, A multi-million-dollar empire waiting to be viciously divided by people who couldn't even pretend to hide their greed. My own nephews stood at the end of the bright hallway, casually checking their expensive Rolex watches, whispering to each other, impatient for the machine to just stop beeping so they could finally cash in. That emotional agony was infinitely worse than the disease tearing through my chest. My physical condition was deteriorating at a terrifying, unstoppable speed. The aggressive tumors were literally crushing my lungs, robbing me of the very air that fueled my existence. Every single breath felt like inhaling broken glass. In those agonizing, endless hours, my fragile faith, which had momentarily flickered back to life, was being violently snuffed out by the harsh reality surrounding me. I tried to pray. I genuinely, desperately tried. I remember weakly moving my dry lips under the heavy oxygen mask, whispering broken, pathetic promises to God. Just give me one more year, I bargained directly at the ceiling. I'll give it all away. I'll build churches. I'll fund orphanages. Just don't let me die in the dark. But the only answer I received was the cold, clinical voice of the chief of medicine telling a nurse to drastically increase my morphine drip because I was actively transitioning. That was their polite, sanitized medical term for dying. They had completely given up on me. My family had given up on me. Even my own body was stubbornly waving the white flag of surrender. The spiritual warfare raging inside that ICU room was incredibly palpable. The night before, I had experienced a terrifying, vivid dream. I saw myself standing in a dark, empty boardroom, surrounded by towering mountains of gold and cash that slowly turned into dead ash right before my eyes. A chilling, familiar voice whispered from the shadows that I had built my entire house on the sand, and the storm had finally arrived. It felt like a final, devastating spiritual warning I had proudly ignored my entire adult life. I wasn't just dying physically. I felt my soul plunging into an eternal void. The darkness in that room felt so heavy, so overwhelmingly oppressive, that it seemed to actively mock my microscopic attempts at faith. I was finally letting go. My resistance was broken. I fully surrendered to the deafening despair. But down the hall, completely unnoticed by my greedy relatives and the exhausted medical staff, a 7-year-old orphan girl named Lily was blindly navigating the hospital corridors. She had been admitted for a severe asthma treatment in the underfunded charity ward, 2 entire floors below my restricted VIP penthouse suite. She was completely blind, carrying a small, worn-out white cane. By all logical human explanations, she should have never, ever been on my floor. Hospital security for the VIP wing was incredibly tight, but somehow, as if guided by an invisible hand, she had effortlessly bypassed every single armed guard, every locked electronic door, and every busy nurse's station. As I lay there crying, feeling my heart begin its final, erratic slowdown, my eyes heavily forced shut by exhaustion, I felt the physical atmosphere in the room violently shift. The heavy spiritual darkness that had been suffocating me suddenly felt as if it was being pierced by a massive beam of light. I couldn't open my eyes, but I heard the precise rhythmic tap-tap of a little white cane getting closer and closer to my door. That day, lying utterly helpless in a bed worth thousands of dollars, surrounded by people secretly waiting for my demise, I couldn't possibly imagine that heaven was already aggressively moving on my behalf. That precise, agonizing moment felt exactly like standing on the absolute terrifying edge of a bottomless cliff, the undeniable point of no return. My lungs practically collapsed on themselves, and an excruciating burning pain violently radiated through every single nerve in my shattered body. The frantic nurses stormed back into the room holding multiple crash carts, and one of the younger doctors hysterically yelled that my oxygen saturation levels were rapidly dropping, drastically below numbers compatible with human life. The storm of chaos inside VIP room 402 was completely deafening. The machines blaring loudly, the medical staff frantically shouting emergency codes. The terrifying sound of heavy equipment being rapidly unboxed to try and artificially jumpstart my failing heart one final time. Thick medical files were thrown onto the small table beside me, each specialized paper documenting my inevitable, fast-approaching demise. Physically, the fight was officially over. It was finally time for Arthur, the unstoppable Wall Street millionaire, to undeniably lose. But spiritually, my soul was making an impossible, desperate decision. Right there, actively drowning in unimaginable physical agony, I internally chose to completely surrender the pathetic illusion of control. Completely stripped of my wealth, my vast influence, and my stubborn pride, I mentally screamed the only sincere prayer that truly mattered. God, I have absolutely nothing left in my bleeding hands. I am totally, undeniably bankrupt before you. If you are real, take over my broken life right now, or just let me go peacefully. It was an absolute blind leap of faith straight into the terrifying darkness I had violently feared my entire life. This wasn't a financial transaction or a desperate boardroom negotiation anymore. It was pure, terrifying, naked surrender of my broken spirit to the Creator. The medical chaos outside my rapidly fading consciousness raged violently. The lead doctor aggressively grabbed the heavy defibrillator paddles, explicitly demanding everyone to immediately stand clear of my bed. But right before he could violently shock my barely responsive chest, a soft, incredibly pure voice cleanly cut through the cacophony of the blaring alarms and the screaming medical professionals like a sharp, undeniable blade. Don't hurt him. He's not leaving yet. Every single highly trained professional in the room instantly froze, completely paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what they were witnessing. There she was. The tiny 7-year-old girl named Lily, dressed in an oversized, faded charity ward hospital gown. She stood confidently at the foot of my expensive bed, completely and utterly unshaken by the chaotic medical emergency escalating around her. Her milky, unseeing eyes were fixed straight ahead, but she wasn't looking at the panicked doctors or the expensive, flashing monitors. It powerfully felt as if she was actively staring straight into the very hidden depths of my struggling, desperate soul. The lead surgeon immediately exploded again, repeating the angry demand I had heard before losing consciousness. Get that blind girl out of this room immediately. Can't you see this man is taking his last breaths? This is absolutely no place for a child. The angry, panicked doctor lunged forward to aggressively grab her skinny arm and forcefully pull her away from my bed. But the very moment his gloved hand brushed her tiny shoulder, something utterly inexplicable, something truly beyond the realm of modern medical science, happened in that sterile VIP suite. He violently pulled his hand back, staggering awkwardly backward, as if he had just touched a highly electrified fence, his face instantly draining of all color. The experienced nurses took an involuntary, synchronized step back, dropping their heavy clipboards to the cold floor in pure, unadulterated shock. The spiritual atmosphere in the room shifted so drastically it felt like the physical air pressure had completely dropped, leaving everyone breathless. The little blind girl didn't even flinch. She slowly raised her small, fragile hand, holding the white cane, and confidently pointed her tiny finger straight at my failing chest. She wasn't just a sick orphan from the charity ward in that pivotal moment. She was a divine, untouchable ally, sent straight to the violent front lines of my spiritual war. And it was exactly when all undeniably seemed lost, that something absolutely impossible began to happen. The massive hospital room, once violently filled with the frantic, deafening noise of modern emergency medicine, suddenly fell into an eerie, undeniably reverent silence. It wasn't the heavy, crushing silence of death that I had so terribly feared. It was the incredibly dense, expectant silence of a Supreme Courtroom, right before a judge delivers the final, world-altering verdict. Lily slowly and deliberately walked toward my bed, her small white cane tapping softly against the polished linoleum floor. The lead surgeon, still visibly shaken and incredibly pale from whatever invisible force had stopped him, didn't dare to move a single muscle or speak again. It was exactly as if a massive, untouchable spiritual presence had completely paralyzed the entire highly trained medical team, silently commanding them to stand still and witness what was about to unfold. Lily stopped perfectly right beside my bed. Even though her milky eyes couldn't physically see my dying, frail body or the chaotic, desperate tangle of IV tubes aggressively attached to my arms, she unerringly reached out and placed her tiny, surprisingly warm hand directly over my rapidly failing heart. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. But the absolute second her soft skin touched me, a massive jolt of pure, indescribable electricity violently surged through my collapsing veins. It wasn't a painful medical shock from a defibrillator. It was a profound, overwhelming spiritual awakening crashing into my soul. "He told me you completely forgot how to talk to him," Lily whispered softly, yet her sweet voice carried an undeniable, towering authority that instantly echoed in every single corner of that VIP room. "He said you foolishly traded your entire heart for gold, Mr. Arthur. But he also said he hasn't forgotten the desperate prayers your mother prayed for you in the dark when you were my age." Tears, hot, stinging, and undeniably real, began to stream uncontrollably down my pale face beneath the heavy oxygen mask. I had aggressively spent millions of dollars trying to permanently erase my humble past. But God had sent a blind orphan girl from the charity ward to violently remind me of exactly where I came from. The divine strategy unfolding in that room was simple, but intensely agonizing. Absolute, unadulterated repentance. With every single ounce of my rapidly fading physical strength, I tightly closed my eyes and engaged in the absolute hardest negotiation of my entire life. I wasn't arrogantly bartering with corporate shares or international real estate anymore. I was actively, painfully surrendering my monumental pride. In the quiet, broken depths of my mind, I sincerely begged the Creator for mercy. I internally forgave the greedy relatives nervously pacing outside the glass door waiting for my money. I completely let go of the massive empire I had ruthlessly built with my own bloody hands. Was the ultimate, desperately necessary act of faith, completely dying to my massive ego right before I physically died. As I mentally whispered my desperate, broken confession, the harsh fluorescent lights of the VIP suite began to flicker subtly, casting long shadows on the stark white walls. The heavy, sterile chemical air in the room suddenly and inexplicably smelled unmistakably like fresh, clean rain falling heavily on dry earth. A tiny, undeniably glorious physical manifestation of the supernatural environment actively shifting around us. The frantic, erratic screaming of my heart monitor began to strangely but undeniably steady out, slowing from a chaotic, panicked screech to a steady, incredibly calm rhythm. If this powerful movement of faith and true repentance is resonating deeply within your own struggling soul right now, I lovingly invite you to subscribe to this channel and share this testimony, because there are millions of broken people out there desperately needing to know that no amount of money in the world can buy the peace that God so freely gives. Lily steadily kept her small hand firmly pressed against my chest. She smiled a gentle, deeply knowing smile, exactly as if she was actively listening to a beautiful conversation none of the highly educated, stunned doctors in that room could possibly hear. I was still medically dying on that expensive bed, my lungs still failing. But exactly at that pivotal, tear-soaked moment as my desperate soul finally found the absolute peace I had spent my entire miserable life frantically searching for, little did I know that the undeniably impossible miracle was already violently released in heaven. I have absolutely no logical, scientific, or modern medical explanation for the exact split microsecond when the impossible miracle violently forcefully invaded VIP room 402. But the absolute second Lily finally finished her sentence, a blinding physical wave of intense, glorious heat, exactly like the most comforting, radiant fire you could ever imagine, powerfully erupted from the very center of my constantly failing chest, exactly where her small, fragile hand rested. It undeniably wasn't a painful, burning heat. It was the absolute, undeniable visceral sensation of aggressive, supernatural cellular reconstruction happening inside my body. The suffocating heavy weight of the massive, aggressive tumors viciously crushing my exhausted lungs literally vanished into thin air. For the very first time in agonizing, excruciating months, my broken chest naturally expanded, dramatically pulling in a massive, glorious, perfectly effortless breath of clean oxygen. I undeniably didn't need the heavy, restrictive medical mask anymore. The frantic, terrified doctors, who had been completely frozen in sheer, unadulterated shock, collectively gasped in absolute horror and amazement. The loud, chaotic beeping of the expensive heart monitor, which had been steadily flatlining into a screeching, terrifying alarm of inevitable demise just minutes ago, suddenly stabilized into a strong, perfectly healthy, incredibly vibrant rhythm exactly like that of a young, unstoppable athlete. The lead surgeon literally collapsed onto his knees on the cold floor right beside my expensive bed, his mouth held wide open, frantically rubbing his wet eyes exactly as if desperately trying to wake up from an impossible, vivid, terrifying hallucination. The aggressive, suffocating dark shadows that had heavily occupied the lonely corners of my VIP suite completely evaporated, instantly replaced by an incredibly powerful, unbelievably warm, almost incredibly golden luminescence that physically bathed every single person standing in that sterile room. It was the undeniable, towering, majestic presence of God Almighty, an incredibly dense, palpable peace so unbelievably heavy that it physically, violently pushed all the crippling fear, sickness, and despair right out the hospital door. I wildly tore off the heavy oxygen mask with my own 2 hands, my lost physical strength inexplicably and aggressively returning to my dying, useless muscles. The paralyzing, agonizing pain that had viciously radiated through my hollow bones completely disappeared, completely replaced by an overwhelming, electric, divine vitality. I was completely, undeniably, miraculously healed. The absolutely impossible had just happened right in front of the world's most expensive medical specialists. The experienced nurses began to explicitly weep uncontrollably, dropping to their trembling knees, absolutely overwhelmed by the undeniable, heavy holiness of the exact moment. We clearly weren't in a modern medical facility anymore. VIP room 402 had violently, undeniably become holy ground. Lily, the tiny blind orphan girl from the charity ward, who had powerfully carried the undeniable authority of a warrior angel, slowly removed her remarkably warm hand from my healed chest. But what happened immediately after this undeniably impossible miracle was even more surprisingly powerful. 2 days later, I walked out of the heavy glass doors of that prestigious hospital exactly on my own 2 feet, not in a creaking wheelchair, not in a tragic body bag, but stepping confidently into the bright, glorious morning sunlight as a completely reborn man. The world-renowned medical specialists had meticulously run every conceivable scan, every single expensive blood test available to modern science, and the impossible results were absolutely identical across the board. Every single microscopic trace of the aggressive, incurable tumors had completely and utterly vanished. The massive medical files detailing my inevitable, highly anticipated death were officially stamped as inexplicable spontaneous remission, their clinical, sanitized, professional term for the undeniable, majestic hand of God. The greedy, impatient relatives who had heartlessly circled my deathbed like vultures were left in sheer, stuttering silence when I aggressively walked into my own massive living room that Friday afternoon. Millions of dollars had undeniably failed me, but the creator of the universe absolutely had not. My massive corporate empire, which I had ruthlessly and arrogantly built on the crumbling sand of endless human greed, was immediately and fundamentally restructured. I didn't just casually toss a few tax-deductible dollars at a local charity to appease my guilty conscience. I violently tore down my entire worldly kingdom to actively begin building his. The incredible millions that had completely failed to buy me a single extra breath in that ICU were now actively funding massive orphanages, building safe havens for the broken, and ensuring that forgotten, desperate children exactly like Lily, Never had to face the terrifying darkness of this world alone again. Speaking of, Lily, she never returned to that underfunded hospital charity ward. The very first official, binding document my high-priced legal team drafted after my miraculous discharge wasn't another ruthless corporate takeover. It was her permanent adoption papers. The tiny, blind spiritual warrior who had confidently carried heaven's towering authority straight into my sterile VIP room legally became my beautiful, beloved daughter. We actively started a massive global foundation in her name, violently pushing back the darkness and bringing real, tangible hope to thousands of lost souls across the globe. She couldn't see the massive physical empire I had built, but she had perfectly seen the fragile, broken state of my eternal soul, when absolutely no one else cared. The absolutely greatest miracle that fiercely invaded room 402 wasn't just the complete, medically impossible eradication of my suffocating physical tumors. The true, undeniable, eternal miracle was the total resurrection of my dead, arrogant, worldly heart. I learned in the absolute hardest, most terrifying way imaginable that you can proudly own half the corporate world, but if you don't intimately know the majestic Creator who actively and graciously holds your very next breath, you are truly the absolute poorest soul alive. If this deeply powerful testimony has touched your spirit today, if you are currently facing an absolutely impossible, terrifying wall and desperately need to be reminded that God still aggressively moves in the darkest hours, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who desperately needs to hear this unshakable truth right now. Never, ever forget, when the loud, chaotic world comfortably declares that your story is completely over, heaven might just be picking up the pen to write your absolute greatest chapter.